The paper is Muon is not that special. Random or inverted spectra work just as well. It's by Shumalov, Da Costa, Zeka, Muksanyu, Masuko, Gilberg, Shinlieb, Gal, and Hennig. That is it's a powerhouse team from Cambridge, Tübingen, and Oxford. And we are jumping straight into the deep end today for all of you AI researchers and ML engineers tuning into AI paper podcasts, because honestly, this research completely shatters how we understand optimization.
It really does. It's a total paradigm shift.
Right. So if you are clipping this for shorts, here is the 60-second breakdown. So for a while now, the prevailing theory behind the massive success of the Muon optimizer is that it perfectly adheres to a specific target geometry using something called linear minimization oracle, or LMO theory. Well, this paper completely dismantles that narrative. The authors introduce Freon, an optimizer that pushes past Muon into mathematically broken quasi-norm regimes, and it actually performs better on models like GPT-2.
Yeah, which is insane on its own, but...
Right. But even wilder, they introduce Kaon. This is an absurd optimizer that takes the gradient's singular values, replaces them with pure random noise, and somehow still matches Muon's state-of-the-art performance. The big reveal here is that precise geometric structure and optimization is basically irrelevant. Success actually comes down to a brutal mechanical trade-off, sacrificing your batch gradient alignment, which they call gamma, to massively boost your descent potential, called phi, paired with optimal step sizes.
Okay, so I want to slow down and really pull this apart because, we've been told for months that spectral optimizers like Muon work specifically because of their elegant geometry.
Yeah, I mean, it is a beautifully constructed narrative, but the authors of this paper prove it is fundamentally an illusion. To understand why, we kind of have to look at LMO theory first.
Linear minimization oracle. Exactly. That theory has been the bedrock for explaining Muon. So in very simple terms, an LMO is this mathematical operation that finds the extreme boundary of a specific shape in a given direction. For optimization, the idea was that, well, Muon works so well because it's strictly adhering to a non-Euclidean geometry. It takes the matrix of gradients and calculates an exact target spectrum, effectively whitening it.
Whitening it,
Right. Meaning all the singular values are mapped perfectly to 1.0. It looks mathematically pristine.
Yeah.
But what this team did was rigorously test the boundaries of that geometric preconditioning.
Right.
And the moment they pushed past the theoretical boundaries, the whole LMO framework just shattered.
Wow. And I want to understand how they tested those boundaries because, well, they didn't just write a counterproof on a whiteboard, right? So it systematically started breaking the rules to see what would happen. And it seems like their first pedagogical test was with something called Truncated SGD. Can you walk us through what they were looking for there?
Absolutely. So to understand Muon, you first have to understand why standard stochastic gradient descent, just normal SGD, struggles with large matrices.
Right.
In standard SGD, if you have excessively large singular values in your gradient, they act like directions of extreme sharp curvature in your loss landscape.
So it's like a cliff.
Yes. If the optimizer takes a step in that direction, it's like stepping off a cliff. The gradient explodes, and the model just becomes unstable. So as an initial test, the researchers created Truncated SGD. They explicitly took the gradient and just zeroed out the largest 5% of the singular values.
Just completely deleted the steepest parts of the cliff.
Precisely. Just chopped them off. And doing that significantly improves performance over standard SGD.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a vital clue. It proves that suppressing large singular values is absolutely mechanically necessary for stability. But, and this is the turning point of the paper, really, Truncated SGD still fails to close the performance gap to Muon. It gets better, but it doesn't match it.
Okay, so just chopping off the top of the mountain isn't enough. There's some other mechanism driving Muon's efficiency. And if zeroing out the top didn't solve it, they had to look for a middle ground, right? I'm assuming that is where the Freon family of optimizers comes in. They built a way to, interpolate between these methods.
Yes, exactly. They developed Freon based on what are called Schatten norms. Without getting bogged down in the deep algebra, just think of Freon as a mathematical formula that applies an update to the matrix using a fractional power. They introduce a parameter, let's call it C. This parameter C acts like a slider for the spectrum of singular values.
So C is literally a dial you can turn to change how the optimizer shapes the data.
Yep, a literal dial.
So what happens as we turn that dial?
Well, if you set the slider at C equals 0, the formula collapses back to standard SGD. You're doing nothing to the spectrum. But if you slide it to C equals 1/2, you arrive exactly at Muon. At 1/2, the formula perfectly normalizes all the singular values to 1.0. You've achieved that mathematically pristine whitening. But the slider doesn't stop there. If you keep pushing it to c equals 1, you hit an endpoint that acts very much like a mathematical pseudo-inverse, basically flipping the spectrum entirely.
Okay, wait. So the LMO theory insists that muon at c equals 1/2 is the absolute optimal state, right? Because it perfectly aligns with that pristine non-Euclidean geometry. But when they actually ran this on GPT-2 and Wikitext-2, what happened when they turned the dial past 1/2?
They jocked a complete empirical bombshell. On these actual large-scale language models, the best performing setting wasn't 1/2.
It wasn't.
No. The optimal performance lived strictly in the region where c is between 1/2 and 1. Specifically, it concentrated around 2/3 to 3/4.
Wait, I'm stuck on this. If c is greater than 1/2, isn't that mathematically forbidden territory in this context? I remember reading that pushing past 1/2 takes you outside the range of any unitarily invariant norm. Does that mean LMO theory is, like, entirely useless for explaining why a setting of 3/4 works so well?
Yes, and this is actually where the paper's title comes from. In rigorous optimization theory, for a descent path to follow a proper, unitarily invariant matrix norm, the mathematical mapping has to preserve certain rules, specifically the triangle inequality.
The idea that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line.
Exactly. But in this regime where c is greater than 1/2, which is known as the quasi-norm regime, the triangle inequality fails. This space is mathematically warped. You are no longer descending a proper norm. You are in fundamentally broken mathematical territory.
Wow.
Yet this broken territory reliably and significantly outperforms the quote-unquote perfect norm regime of Muon.
That is wild. I mean, LMO theory is like tuning a highly specific, aerodynamically perfect race car, right? You follow all the laws of physics and you get a fast car. But then the authors introduced Freon, pushed the slider past perfect physics into this broken quasi-norm space, which feels like strapping a massive, unstable, solid rocket booster to a shopping cart, and you somehow cross the finish line faster.
That is exactly what happens. And it proves conclusively that LMO theory cannot be the primary explanation for the performance gains. If a mathematically warped, non-geometric update performs better than the geometrically perfect one, then geometry is just not the driving force.
Okay, but if Freon proves that an elegant geometry isn't the optimal state, I have to ask, how far can we push this? Because if we're already breaking the laws of physics with the shopping cart, what happens if we abandon the concept of shape entirely? Because looking at the data in the paper, it seemed like almost any Freon update with Cree greater than 0 performed remarkably well, as long as those massive singular values at the top were suppressed.
Yeah, and that exact realization led the team to formulate a really profound hypothesis. If the specific shape doesn't matter, maybe the shape is entirely irrelevant. So, to prove this, they built what they explicitly call an absurd optimizer, and they named it Kaon.
Kaon is the part of the paper that genuinely made me laugh out loud. If we go back to our analogies, Muon is like a symphony orchestra following a conductor's meticulously crafted sheet music, right? The geometry is perfect. Kaon is like taking that sheet music, throwing it into a fire, replacing it with a literal roll of the dice, and the orchestra somehow still plays a perfect Beethoven symphony.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
How does Kaon actually work mechanically?
Well, Kaon computes no linear minimization oracle. It targets no specific Schatten norm. It simply takes the singular values of the gradient and replaces them with uniform random noise.
Just pure uncorrelated noise.
Well, mechanically, it's slightly more sophisticated than just pulling random numbers out of thin air. They generate the noise using chaotic iterations. They use a generalized third-order logistic recurrence. Think of it as a mathematical blender. You feed a number into this formula, and it creates a feedback loop.
Right. They set the main dial on that blender, the lambda parameter, to 4.1.
Exactly. When you push the lambda parameter above 4, the recurrence is pushed deep into what's known as the chaotic regime. The numbers never settle down to a fixed point. Instead, this mathematical blender creates a broad stationary distribution of values that bounce around infinitely between 0 and 1.175. It's a completely stochastic redistribution of the spectrum. It possesses absolutely zero coherent geometry.
Yet, despite having zero geometry, this completely absurd optimizer closely matches Muon's performance at scale when training GPT-2.
Yeah.
That feels like it shouldn't be physically possible. How can pure chaos optimize a language model? Does it even converge?
This is the theoretical kicker that makes the paper so robust. Kaon amazingly retains classical O of 1 over K convergence guarantees.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It converges just as reliably as the mathematically pristine methods. To understand how chaos converges, you have to separate the singular values from the singular vectors. Kaon throws the singular values into a blender, randomizing their magnitude. But it keeps the singular vectors, the actual directional information of the gradient, completely intact.
Okay, let me pause you there. If keeping the direction but randomizing the magnitude works just as well, does that mean the entire multi-million-dollar industry of designing precise target spectra for neural network optimization is basically just a complex placebo effect? Like, we're all just inventing fancy math to hide the fact that all we really needed to do was stop the large singular values from exploding?
Yes, that's exactly it. The authors are suggesting that the precise target geometry is essentially a mathematical fiction. We invented it because it looks elegant on a chalkboard and it satisfies our desire for theoretical purity. But Kaon proves that state-of-the-art performance does not require strict adherence to a precise target geometry. It's a direct counter-argument to the LMO-based explanations.
But if Kaon and Freon prove that the geometry is a placebo, there still has to be an underlying mechanical truth, right? Something is physically happening in the weights of the neural network that causes these optimizers to succeed. If it's not geometry, what is the actual engine driving this?
To find the true engine, the authors discarded the LMO framework entirely and looked at the exact local Taylor expansion of the loss function. This gets into the framework developed by researchers Davis and Drusviatsky. They decomposed the update step into two structurally revealing quantities. This is where the actual mechanics of modern optimization live. The first quantity is called batch gradient alignment, which they denote as gamma.
Let's break gamma down. Batch gradient alignment.
Right, so gamma measures how perfectly your update direction aligns with the true gradient of the loss landscape.
Okay, so gamma is your steering wheel. If gamma is high, you are pointing your car perfectly down the steepest part of the hill toward the destination.
Exactly. Yeah. But the Taylor expansion reveals a second quantity, which they call local directional descent potential, denoted as phi. Phi is effectively the inverse of the local curvature in the direction you're stepping.
The inverse of the curvature. So if the curvature is a sharp, dangerous mole, phi is very small. If the curvature is wide and flat, phi is very large.
Oh, correct. Phi dictates how far you can step in a given direction without the quadratic penalty, the curvature of the landscape blowing up in your face.
So if gamma is how accurately you steer, phi is the size of the engine you are allowed to drop into the car. It is your raw capacity to move downhill safely. And the paper suggests there is a brutal trade-off between the steering wheel and the engine, right?
A massive trade-off. When you look at the exact Taylor expansion, the reduction in your loss is driven by the engine, phi, multiplied by a quadratic function of your steering alignment, gamma, and your learning rate. Different optimizers implicitly choose where to sit on this trade-off. What the researchers found is that changing your direction of descent away from the pure, true gradient naturally suppresses your steering accuracy. Your gamma drops.
You're intentionally turning the steering wheel off course.
Yes, but deliberately sacrificing that alignment steering slightly into the rough allows you to find paths where the curvature is significantly flatter. By giving up gamma, you enable a massive amplification of phi.
So the math is literally telling you to deliberately steer your car slightly off course, because making that specific sacrifice allows you to drop a massive V8 engine into the chassis without spinning out on the corners.
That is the mechanical truth. You are trading steering precision for raw, stable power. But there is a critical caveat to this V8 engine analogy. Having a massive engine is completely useless if you don't know how hard to press the gas pedal. Realizing the benefit of a massive phi hinges entirely on using step sizes that are perfectly tuned to exploit it.
Which brings us to their analysis of step sizes. I was really surprised by their findings on the random feature model. They showed that exact optimal gradient descent, meaning perfect steering, maximum gamma, actually achieves greater loss reduction in theory than spectral descent methods like Muon or Freon. So if standard gradient descent is theoretically better, why don't we just use that?
Because of the gas pedal. To achieve that theoretical optimum, standard gradient descent requires a highly oscillatory, practically unrealizable step-size schedule. The optimal learning rate wildly fluctuates from step to step based on the exact local curvature. You could never actually schedule it in practice.
It's like trying to drive by slamming the gas, then slamming the brakes. Every millisecond, you'd completely destroy the car.
It's exactly. Spectral descent methods succeed mechanically because their optimal step size is practically constant. It's proportional to 1 over the Frobenius norm of dA squared. Because that specific value barely fluctuates during training, you can set a fixed learning rate and just let the massive engine run continuously. Muon and Freon don't succeed because they're tracking an ideal global geometry. They succeed because their specific distortion of the gradient happens to guarantee step size optimality.
That is incredible. The elegant geometry is just a byproduct. It's a side effect that happens to stabilize the optimal step size.
It's an accidental feature that we completely mistook for the main mechanism.
Wow. But, theoretical trade-offs in quadratic models are great on a whiteboard. The engineers tuning in right now need to know how this actually manifests when you are training a massive, messy, large language model like GPT-2. And more importantly, how do you compute these crazy quasi-norm fractional updates without crashing a cluster of GPUs?
Yeah, the transition from the whiteboard to the GPU clusters where things get really fascinating and really messy. When they tried to map that naive mathematical theory directly onto the GPT-2 architecture, it exposed distinct limitations. The actual loss landscape in a real LLM is highly stochastic. It's just noisy. Because of that noise, the mathematically optimal exponent that sliders C in Freon fluctuates wildly from batch to batch.
I want to understand this local versus global distortion. For a single batch of data passing through the network, if you evaluate the per-step decrease in loss, the math confirms that setting the Freon slider to C equals 1 is optimal. But globally, across the entire training dataset over thousands of steps, targeting C equals 1 fails completely. How is that possible? How can the absolute perfect step for the current batch be a terrible step for the dataset as a whole?
It really comes down to the signal-to-noise ratio in stochastic batches. The local geometry of a single batch is severely distorted by outliers. Think of it this way. The largest singular values in a single batch's gradient are often driven by idiosyncratic noise. Just one weird, unrepresentative data point pulling the gradient really hard in one direction. It tricks the optimizer into thinking that direction is vitally important, making C equals 1 look perfect locally.
Oh, I see. So you are overfitting to the noise of the current batch.
Exactly. But the authors made a crucial empirical observation here. When you look globally across the whole dataset, the gradients actually agree most in the middle of the singular value spectrum. The top values are noise, but the middle values represent the generalizable consensus of the data. That mid-range is where your signal-to-noise ratio is highest.
So by targeting that mid-range, which corresponds to setting your Freon exponent C around 3/4, you are actively filtering out the noise. You naturally suppress the variance of your steering alignment, gamma, across batches, while still keeping that V8 engine Phi amplified.
You're threading the needle between stability and power. But as you alluded to earlier, identifying that C equals 3/4 is the practical sweet spot is only half the battle.
Yeah.
Actually, computing a matrix raised to the fractional power of -3/4 is a severe computational nightmare.
Right. If you're an ML engineer, you can't just type matrix to the power of 0.75 mitten PyTorch and expect it to run efficiently on a massive scale.
Definitely not. Normally, to compute these matrix functions, algorithms use polynomial iterations. A common one is the Graham-Newton-Schultz iteration, but polynomial iterations are highly unstable outside of the C equals 1/2 muon regime. To calculate them, the algorithm has to explicitly form incredibly poorly conditioned matrices, specifically by multiplying matrix G by G transpose.
I know this causes something called condition number squaring, which is terrifying for hardware. Can you explain why that crashes a GPU?
Sure. A condition number basically measures how distorted a matrix is. It's the ratio between its largest and smallest dimensions. If your largest eigenvalue is 10,000 times your smallest, your condition number is 10,000. When you explicitly multiply matrix G by G transpose, you mathematically square that condition number. 10,000 squared becomes 100 million.
And in the lower precision formats that we use to train LLMs like BF16 or F16, what happens to a number like 100 million?
It basically falls off the edge of what the computer's memory can hold. The hardware cannot represent that span of values accurately in 16 bits. Floating point errors accumulate instantaneously. Spurious negative eigenvalues appear out of nowhere. The system rounds to infinity, spits out not a number, and your training run violently crashes.
You literally blue screen a multi-million-dollar cluster because the numbers got too wide to fit in memory. So if polynomial iterations crash the hardware, how do the authors stabilize Freon computation so we can actually use it?
They developed a provably optimal iteration based on something called QDWH, which stands for QR-based dynamically weighted Haley. Instead of using polynomials, which are really rigid, they use generalized rational functions to approximate the fractional power, utilizing the Remez algorithm. Rational functions are basically divisions of polynomials, which allows them to bend and fit asymptotes much more gracefully.
Okay, but how does that prevent the condition number from squaring and crashing the GPU?
To execute this without squaring the condition number, they use a brilliantly designed algorithm called a coupled Chol iteration. It merges Cholesky factor tracking with block QR decompositions. The genius of the block QR trick is that it allows the algorithm to find a backdoor. It completely avoids ever explicitly forming that poorly conditioned G times G transpose matrix. It only exponentiates a highly stable, well-conditioned single-step matrix.
Oh, wow. So they basically sneak around the catastrophic multiplication step entirely.
Yes. And the result is doubly exponential convergence and extreme forward stability. You can run this complex fractional quasi-norm update entirely in BF16 or F16 precision without the matrix blowing up.
That is a masterclass in algorithmic engineering. So let's step back and look at what we've uncovered today. We have mathematically solved the compute problem with the coupled Chol iteration, which allows us to deploy Freon at scale in low precision. This lets us hit that sweet spot of C equals 3/4 to maximize the signal-to-noise ratio. And in doing all of this, we are completely ignoring the elegant, perfect geometry of LMO theory, and instead we're just coasting on the massive descent potential generated by deliberately steering off course.
It is a profound triumph of understanding actual messy mechanics over theoretical aesthetics, and honestly, it forces a very uncomfortable reevaluation for our entire field.
What do you mean by uncomfortable?
We'll think about how much time, compute, and human capital we spend designing optimization architectures based on beautiful geometric theories. If this paper proves conclusively that state-of-the-art performance can be achieved by completely ignoring the geometric structure of the lost landscape, or even by randomizing it with chaotic blenders, it raises a critical question. Does our community's fundamental reliance on geometric intuition and deep learning theory actually blind us? Are we artificially restricting ourselves from finding more chaotic yet highly effective optimization pathways just because they don't look pretty on a chalkboard? Are we optimizing for elegant math instead of actual mechanics?
That is the exact thought I want to leave everyone with. Because sometimes progress isn't about playing the meticulously crafted sheet music perfectly. Sometimes you just need to throw the music in the fire, roll the dice, deliberately steer into the rough, and let the chaotic engine do the heavy lifting. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you some new tools and new questions for your own work. Keep questioning your assumptions, keep testing those boundaries, and we will catch you on the next deep dive right here on AI Paper Podcasts.